Mines to woodland trails. It's quite a story. And I took this headline, that Historic Jacksonville Gathers a Park Around Itself. I took that right out of the Mail Tribune. Really, I think it'd be best if I sat down. I am so used to standing up when I'm talking, but I'm afraid I'm going to be blocking your view, so I'll sit down briefly anyway.
You're blocking the screen.
I'll stand. You'll just have to look past me. I'll turn sideways. Okay. I got to see my notes also. This program was originally developed for the Windows in Time program, so I had to kind of introduce people to Jacksonville, that it's an enchanting landscape. And I had to put this one in. My house is right over there. You can see it up on the hillside. It's not that big. But can you imagine in 1885 somebody saying, it's not a more picturesque place as scarcely ever my fortune to behold, for an old gold mine camp. So our golden trails have turned into 16 miles of real walking trails. And it's been an economic boom to Jacksonville as we protect the cultural and natural heritage of historic Jacksonville. And of course, it all started with gold. And if you've been just up the street here, you can find where gold was first discovered. I took my kids out there frequently when I was teaching to show them where it all happened. You might recognize this picture. It was in the Mail Tribune several weeks ago. And so the woodlands now are the heritage left over from the days of the gold mining. And I like to think it's the most successful small town, total volunteer land and trail preservation project in the state of Oregon. You notice all the qualifiers in there? Being small town, total volunteer, of course. But I think it is. I think without a doubt, what we've pulled off here and all of you folks have pulled off is absolutely fabulous. From the very beginning, we've had a three-prong approach. And that, of course, land preservation, establishing recreational trails, and then the education part. And just in the last several weeks, I've had about 300 kids out on the trails. And I got done with twice now, this last week and the week before. A girl walked up to me and said, "Mr. Smith, I didn't realize Jacksonville had so much history." I said, "We haven't even gotten started yet." But yeah, Jacksonville does have an amazing history. Can you imagine any other town in Oregon with 70% of its downtown area completely surrounded by preserved land? So we got started in this, and we're trying to get this thing rolling. And I got talking to John Jones. He worked for the city of Medford, and had a couple of his kids in my room. And he said, "You put smiling kids, faces of kids on the front page of the Mail Tribune, and you will be successful." And the Mail Tribune has been fabulous in covering us. Boy, that goes back a long ways. And I have over 500 articles in our files from national magazines and, of course, the Mail Tribune, local papers, and so forth like that. So the media has been one of the successes of getting the word out about what's happening here in Jacksonville. And gathering a park around itself has been quite an effort. This was just in the paper several weeks ago. And so each year we bring out, of course, scores of kids. I have teachers calling me, emailing me, and so on. When can I get my kids out there? My big thing is watch out for the poison oak. But these kids, it's life-changing to a lot of them, because a lot of these kids are coming from the downtown schools and they don't have any access to these trails. And it's been, wow, quite a march there. We sometimes even make it up to the cemetery. Now, I'll show you how old that picture is. See the little boy right there? That's your cousin. That's little Matthias. He's now 22 years old. These are my grandkids sitting over there, and they're real surprised. That's little Matthias, yeah. And of course, taking him out to where gold was first discovered was really an important spot, because the kids really felt like they were part of history. Kids did a lot of work, painting, worked on the trails, and so forth. So now we begin the tale of stitching together 21 properties, 16 miles of trails, and each property has its own story. but I only have time for 8. I love this one. The 6 Bs. Can you imagine that? BLM, Brit, Beekman, Burkholder, Begley, and my most favorite one is BB with 2 Bs in it. So we'll start off with the Beekman Woods. That's what started the whole thing. $126,000, 23 acres in 1994. In 1994 is when we actually signed the final contract. We started in 1989, and it's right in the heart of historic Jacksonville. So Beekman, I live right here. Joe Raymond, who we'll be talking about, lived right there. We were next door neighbors. So that's the land we're talking about. About 23 acres. And all of a sudden, one day, a for sale sign shows up on the property. And then, a few days later, a little vandalism was done on it. And words that I cannot repeat. And then they came by and scrubbed it all off. And then it was knocked down to the ground, and little deer feet were stenciled across the back of it. That was our start. So I get talking to Joe Raymond, who's sitting right here. I was walking down Laurelwood one day, and he's walking up, and I'm walking down, and he has this really pained look on his face. He says, "What can we do about this?" I wish he'd asked me 20 years later. I said, "I don't know." Well, he called a number. And guess what? It was Eugene. And it was the state of Oregon, the chancellor's office, if I remember right, wasn't it, that you called. And they said, "Yeah, we inherited this from the Beekmans, and it's now time to put it up for sale." Beautiful timing. Jacksonville was under a building moratorium. You couldn't build anything on it. It was zoned for multiple housing, but you couldn't put a house on it because of the building moratorium. Therefore, the price was reduced. So that's why 23 acres went for $126,000. So we ended up with, all of a sudden, these newspapers start showing up. Look at that. Hillside Neighbors Fight Sale. Well, that wasn't quite the way we wanted it. Those are your 2 kids? Daniel and Michael. Yeah, Michael are out there walking. And then you start seeing it changing a little bit. Group forms to fight hillside development. The word fight is still in there. I love this one. Forms to save the woods. That's the way we like it, warm and fuzzy. We're not fighting it. So this is our first big public meeting. Joe was running it, got it all organized. We put out the messages to everybody. We had probably 50 people show up down at the school. And we threw out, some people started bidding against each other in fundraising. We walked away with about $30,000 in pledges that first night. And that meant that we were going to really get rolling on this thing, but we still didn't know what we were doing. But he's the one that laid out the vision and at our first meeting in 1989, November. And then people started stepping forward, like Witteveen. The Witteveen's. John had just passed away, and Mrs. Witteveen donated one of the biggest gifts at that time. And there's a trail that is dedicated to John Witteveen out behind the Beekman house. And Mrs. Witteveen was still hiking the trail up until about a year ago. She was 97 years old. And Lynn was her mentor that always had her walking sticks ready and everything like that. It was really something. And then she passed away right after that. And so it took 6 years. We raised $126,000. And the Beekman Woods deed was finally given to the city. And we were going to go out of business. We'd accomplished what we wanted to do. And then guess what? Brit came on the market. Brit was outside the urban growth boundary. It was during another building moratorium. We had 2 building moratoriums going on. So we had 180 acres that went for $140,000. Timing was perfect on this stuff. Amazing. And Southern Oregon College had inherited that, and so they're the ones that put it on the market. So when we talk about Brit, of course, that's the piece right there. Quite large, and it comes right into the town, into the historic core. So 80 acres for $140,000. And like I said, it was during a building moratorium, and it was outside the urban growth boundary. So that's a whole story. I have a video there that didn't play, so I'll move on. It describes a little bit. We got some state grants for this. Phil Garr was the one that was our president by then. He was the one that was really pushing, raising the fundraise. He had a real knack at this thing. And before we knew it, we had the $140,000 raised. That's a whole story in itself, how it happened. So we're down to 2 properties. Let's go out of business. I mean, why do you need us? Well, we had 19 more to go. Now, here, this is one of the most beautiful stories of all. This is the city of Medford land. $1,000. It was worth, at that time, $100,000, and it was 10 acres of land, known as a quarry. So there it is, right there. Butts up right up against the cemetery and Highway 230. This is what it used to look like. If you go past that big scar there, it was, they had bought it for $1,040 and then resold it 82 years later. So this is what it looks like today. So one day, I'm out there with one of my students, Brian Mulholland, who is sitting right there. Hi, Brian. Wave a little bit. That's Brian. Believe it or not, he was 10 years old. Or no, I guess you were 11 by this time. And we were walking up along the crest there, and I had looked on the map and realized that the city of Medford owned it. I was curious on how in the world the city of Medford would own 10 acres inside of Jacksonville. And that story came out later. It was that crusher. Well, they had inherited the railroad and for a while, and the city of Medford had to keep it going, so they needed gravel, so they blasted that hillside to get gravel for ballast. So that's the story behind that. So, but here I am walking up there on a Saturday morning with Brian, about 10 o'clock in the morning, and we were up on that crest, and I said, Brian, this all belongs to the city of Medford. And I'll never forget what he said to me. You remember, Brian? How do we get it? He was learning. And so, crazy thing happens. I said, well, you have to contact the city of Medford. You have to talk to Andy Anderson, the city administrator, and you have to make an appointment with him. So a couple days later, I'm sitting at my desk. He comes wandering in my room after school, and he says, I just made an appointment with Andy Anderson. This kid had no fear. And he said, John Robert is going with me. And the 2 tallest kids in the whole school. And Andy Anderson had no idea that 2 12-year-old boys were walking in on him. They just saw some names on the schedule. So Brian turned, and I said, wait a minute, Brian, you got to have a plan. You can't just walk in to see the city manager. You got to have some kind of, I said, okay, let's do it. Okay, have him give it to us. Just have him hand it to us, free. I said, that's the best deal. Then I opened up my desk. We've been selling Woodland t-shirts, and I had $250 on my desk. And I said, Brian, offer him $250. You know, a 12-year-old kid getting away with all kinds of stuff. And he's okay. And then I picked up my camera, and I tossed it at him, and I said, oh, and get some pictures, too. So 2 pictures were taken. So here's John Robert on the left. He is now an FBI agent in the Boston office, special agent. And Brian, sitting right back here, he's a fire specialist. He's worked for the BLM and you're jumping out of helicopters now, I guess, aren't you, Brian?
Tell him where to go,
yeah. He works with fire suppression using helicopters. And he repels out of helicopters, has. Are you gotten too old for that now? He used to do that. So they came up with this plan. And so then he takes it back to the city council, personally. I back out of it. I don't want anything to do with it. I stay home that night. I wanted to be there so bad. I wanted Brian to handle this thing. He goes into the city council and makes the plea with them that Mr. Smith, meanwhile, Andy Anderson, that's right, got back to you and said, okay, $1,040. That's what we paid for it. We'll sell it to you for actually going to the city. But so he goes down to the city council, makes the proposal to them, $1,040 for this 40 acres of land. And he says, and Mr. Smith has $250 in his desk. And Walt Jaskowitz, who was on the city council, he said, I can throw in 250 in this whole thing. And Mayor Tony at the time said, I think the city can come up with $540 out of the park fund. And that's how this whole thing was done. And so Jacksonville chips in money for parkland. And here's a picture of Brian that right after we got it, standing on his land. And here he is all grown up.
That's pretty cool.
But his story doesn't stop there. So the Ziegler Woods donation. Brian and I are looking over the map one day, trying to find out some more land to buy, and we have the map laid out in front of us. And we're looking. I always thought that the land between the Brit Woods and the highway was all one piece of land. But it turns out it's not. It is, there's a little narrow piece. It's about half a mile long, a little over half a mile long, and just a few feet wide, but that is the creek. And so Brian and I got looking at it, and I go down to the county, and it's owned by Sarah Ziegler. You all have heard her name now. But Sarah Ziegler, who's Sarah Ziegler? So, where do you go when you want a history question answered? You go to the History Center. And I'm there, walk in, and I said, do any of you know a Sarah Ziegler? Well, they did a quick look. She'd been dead for 100 years.
Gosh.
And she owned land right here in Jacksonville.
Huh.
I said, do anything about the Ziegler family? Well, we have a Z file here. So the Z file was about this thick. Now it's really thick, but it was real thin. And so they pulled out this application to become a member of the Historical Society. By the way, if you're not a member of the Historical Society, please do. It's a great organization. And so we're looking at this file, and it says, Zila Ziegler von Tress said that her grandfather founded Jacksonville. We'd never heard of them. Well, it turns out their name is on a building down here. Huh. And somebody had just taken that because of that comment and dropped it in the Z file. Now I had a phone number. Okay, I add back. This woman had to be in her 90s. No way. Third generation of a founder of Jacksonville. So I gave a call. My fingers are kind of nervous. It's on a Saturday morning. I dial the phone expecting, hello, City Zoo, or something like that. It's, hello. I said, Zila? Yes. And so I explained who I was. I said, you know, your family owns 8 acres here in Jacksonville, and I just checked with the sheriff's tax office, and they're going to be selling it in a sheriff's sale. She says, oh my goodness, I forgot. I think the taxes were $6 a year on it at that time. It wasn't very much. So she got on an airplane and flew out and walked the trail. So she wanted to relive some of her family's roots. It's been about 30 years since she'd been to Jacksonville. So we got talking and negotiating and so on. And so she and her nephew, Vernon, gave the land to the city of Jacksonville. And so that one of our hike-a-thons then was with her as they cut the ribbon and so on. And then she got to walk the full length of her grandmother's trail. And that was one of our hike-a-thons, one of our very early ones. And that's Phil Garr, the president, back behind there. And, there's Joan and my wife walking on the Ziegler Trail. Some of my kids walking on the Ziegler Trail. And then we had a ribbon cutting. One of when we dedicated the bridge out there, which has now been replaced, and hanging out down there with kids. It's now a National Historic Land, or National Recreational Trail. That year, I applied for it. We had to go through quite a deal through the National Park Service. There were only 2 trails that year that got to be a National Recreational Trail. Our trail and that trail is in Selma. Remember the famous one where they tear gassed all the marchers and so on? That is now a National Recreational Trail. So we got in the same year that the Selma Trail got in. So we're on the website, there are only 2 trails listed: Sarah Ziegler and the Selma Trail. It's really something. Now we're into the B's again, the Burkholder and the Chinese diggings and so forth. kids see that sign and they say, Mr. Smith, there are no elephants up there. I said, I know, the sign works. So BLM is famous for being a checkerboard. And these were old gold mines that had been abandoned. And they are the pieces that did not touch. So this was the problem. They were going to give them away. And Mayor Cecil went to the BLM and said, no, we're starting to build a trail system. Don't give these BLM properties away. They were going to do some trading. And so we ended up preserving them, but they didn't touch. So that was going to be a problem. So Ray Foster comes into the story here, one of our board members. And we went to the Frontina family and asked them if they would be interested in selling their property that joined two of them. Then we went to BLM to see if we could raise the money. And I remember Genevieve Rasmussen saying to us, we never buy land inside of a city. You know, they're outside the city. But for you, we will. And I'll never forget what a great promise that was. So the Frontinos were right there. Yeah. So that, now we've got the 20 connected to the 40 with their 27 acres in between. Ray just went over, where's Ray? Okay, yeah, you just went over and knocked on Mitch Milovich's door, didn't you? And said, would you be interested in selling your sister's land? Oh, that's right, you knew, okay.
She thought I was pretty swell. I asked cachet.
So it worked. There's Mitch right there. And his sister came up and they cut the ribbon and ended up selling it to us for about $97,000. So now we've got 3 of the pieces connected. Now we have this 110 acre, the Chinese digging sitting over here. We got to do that piece. And that's the Burkholder piece. Is Mark here? Okay, he's on our board. Mark is one that owned it. I found out who the owner was, along with 3 of his partners. Got on the phone and called him. He is in his car crossing the Great Salt Lake salt flats, back in the days when you could still talk on your telephone. And I asked him, I said, would you be interested in selling it? He said, yes, I would be. And he's a lawyer with a history degree. I knew I had him. And he's been president of the Woodlands now, and he's been on our board for quite a while. So it's Panorama Point. I had a kid the other day up there. He says, oh, we're up here at Paranormal Point. It just so happened it came in 2 pieces. You know, this whole project is charmed. It came in 2 pieces, so it didn't have to go through any process of splitting it. One 7.5 acres and the other 7.5 acres. We talked to BLM, who wouldn't buy land inside a city, another time to do this. So they bought the 7.5 acres on one side, and through the Trust for Public Land in the city of Jacksonville, we got anybody play lottery in here? Thank you. It's a lottery grant that came, and so they came up with $500,000 to buy that. So it was broken up into 2 parts. The BLM came on there because of the endangered species that's growing there, the fritillaria. So that was what they gave it toward. And the other one came just because it was the city of Jacksonville that needed a grant, so I guess. So Mark Burkholder and his partners, Corpus and Tom Parks, who used to be, some of you know Tom. He used to be the mayor here in Jacksonville for years. I had both his kids in my 5th grade class. And the Trust for Public Land was very much involved in that thing too. So now, a little publicity. You always do that. That's really important. So our hikeathon was held on top of the knoll, or Paranormal Point. Also known as the knoll and the Burkholder property. And my kids gave speeches and so forth up there. And what a great place to be, especially if it snows. My house is right there. And Joe's house is right there. And Ray's house is right there. And the Oregon Trail, we do have an Oregon Trail here in Jacksonville, but it's not that Oregon Trail. It goes down to Oregon Street. Oh, and by the way, we have an Applegate Trail too, but not that Applegate Trail. It goes down to Applegate Street. Those are my parents walking on the Oregon Trail. So Dad was about 92 and Mother was about 88 in that picture. They loved to go out and hike. So off to Washington. Now, Brian comes back into the story for the third time. He would call me, and he knew I walked down to school, and sometimes his mother would going to work would drop him off near the Presbyterian Church, the historic one. And we'd get on, and we'd walk, and we'd talk about things going all the way down to school. And I remember we were just going around behind the old school when he said to me, why don't we, we'd been looking at this Amway contest. He says, why don't we enter it? I said, Brian, what would we do? I mean, how can we compete nationally on something like this with kids? And he started lining out all the things. I remember we turned on to Huner's right there when you said, you made a list just like that, boom, 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 boom. And so I got to school and I wrote it out. And we sent it in. And guess what? We won. But they wouldn't tell us what we won. We had to be back in Orlando to win it. So here you are winning a national prize, but you don't have any idea what it is. And so it was the class act one, and I got to take 2 kids plus a third one. She happened to be vacationing there that week from my classroom, so she got involved. That's Christy. But there's John Robert on the left. That's the FBI agent. And Brian Mulholland, the guy on the right, who likes to jump out of helicopters. And what up? We got to see more things. And I think John Robert never realized that he'd end up working in Washington off and on, because going through Flat Sea and all the other things that he had to go through to become a special agent. We got to go through the White House, the Capitol. Then this thing was amazing. They got to speak in front of 10 U.S. senators. And we practiced these speeches. Oh, Brian, remember practicing. Couldn't mess up in front of any of them. Oh, your name tag's crooked, Ryan. And John Glenn was there. Bob Kerrey was there. Does anybody know who? I couldn't figure out who this middle senator was sitting there. I don't know if anybody recognizes him. And so they have a reception afterwards, and John Glenn, amazing. He's going around, Bob Kerrey too, he's out there walking, talking, and so on. And I look over and I see Brian talking to John Glenn, just like he was his old friend. Then he's over to Kerry and so on. And this is what I end up with. Can you imagine having to Larry from John Glenn? I looked that up. It's worth $400. Not my name, his. If it's on one of his astronaut pictures, it's worth about $6,000 to have a picture on it. So anyway, the kids had a great time at that. National Geographic shows up and takes our picture. And then, of course, the media blitz that's happened on camera and so forth. And then another part of this thing that comes out of this is this award-winning video that eventually brought in $1.2 million. That's another whole story in itself. So here's our next national award. We are off to SeaWorld. But in that one, you had to be present to get the money. They would not mail it to you. You had to go there. So I had entered this contest, and I came down, and I told the kids, I said, I just got a call from SeaWorld. We've won this contest, but we won't know until we get there, and I can only take 2 kids. And now remember, this kid said, let's just take the whole class. So I said, stay there, right there, before cell phones. I ran down to the office, I called again, I said, Miss Chick, can I take the whole class and bring them? She says, you get them here, we'll pay for everything. Imagine a field trip, whole 5th grade class.
All right.
So I came back, I said, kids, we got to raise some money. And we need $6,000 to pay for airfare. One kid said, my parents would pay anything to get me out of the house for a week. And they did. So we needed $6,000 for the tickets. $9,000 came in. These headlines were all the way from Middle California all the way through Oregon, and people were mailing in money and so on. So that got us, we were able, yeah, there's your daughter right there. And so off we went, had a great time. And Phil Garr, the president of the Woodlands, came along with us. They got a little bit of sun, a little bit of everything. Oh, they had to give speeches. That was really important. We practiced and practiced. And then we got #1 in the nation. We didn't know. That's right, Samu is right over there in the pool there. And we got the prize of $12,500. I didn't tell the kids, but that prize, that trophy is recycled beer cans. Because Budweiser was behind this whole thing. Budweiser owns SeaWorld.
Oh, really?
So then comes the media attention. Oh my goodness, we were on television, so and so. I get back to class after all the media hype is over with. I said, kids, we got $12,500. It's going to buy an awful lot of pizza. So what are we going to do with it? I said, we could buy some land. We've got the Keystone piece right there. Why don't we go after that, the Begley property? Well, we had contacted the Begleys several years prior. Phil Garr had contacted them. They said, no, we're going to build a couple houses up there, 1, maybe 2 houses. It's going to be a retirement and so forth. And we're not interested in selling it. This is where the gold mines actually sit. They'd bought it sight unseen for $49,000. And so I started talking to the kids. I said, why don't we just write some letters to them? And so they decided to do that. And they got busy writing letters to Begleys. And amazing what they put in there. If you sell us your 10 acres, we'll put you in a parade. Build a statue, and you will be famous. And this is absolutely true. This is what they put in their letters. And then we mailed them off at the end of April, and I didn't hear a word. I thought that I'd really ticked them off. Not a word. And then just before the 4th of July, this phone call comes. We need to talk. I said, okay, he said, we're coming up. So they came up. I met them in a restaurant here in Jacksonville. And Mrs. Begley sitting there, I just love those letters. I just love those. I knew I had her. And she said she's a children's writer of books. And so that's why she really loved the letters. And then Mr. Begley was really thinking. I said, this is the way you do it. You put a high price on it, you give it to us a lower price, you take that, and you can put against your taxes, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. He said, I'll go talk to my tax man. And then, pretty soon, the call came. I was down here at the Miller House, the city offices, when he sends the offer in, $120,000, coming by fax. I'm just standing there by this fax machine I'd taken over. I said, 80,000. A few minutes later, 110 comes back. So I got another marking pen. I said, okay, 90,000. And then here it comes up, 100. Oh, my zero slipped. It comes back 100,000. Just then, John Dodaro, city councilor, walks by. I said, John, should I buy the land? He says, go for it. So I wrote, sold, and sent it back to him. That's how we made the deal, 5 minutes.
Oh my gosh.
And he said, you will pay interest. I said, okay. I want 5 years and $20,000 a year to pay it off. He says, okay, we'll go for it. So we ended up paying about $4,000 in interest, but we paid it off in 4 years. That's all. So it came out really good. So this next news headline. You don't get that very often in the classroom, do you? So the $12,500 was presented to the city council, and here are the, in this particular picture, the Frontinos, the Burkholders, the Begleys all together. So the Begleys are right there in the center, deciding that this was the best use of their land was as a park. So that was great. So we're certainly appreciative of what they did. So then we have another piece down here that would connect us to Applegate Street. What about that? So there it is right there. So I'm out walking the trail. It was private land, and Dr. Wilkinson came over to me. He lived next door, and he said, Larry, what's the chance of buying this land? I think Mrs. Beebe would like to sell it. I said, well, we're buying Rich Gulch right now, the Begley property. I said, we can't really do much. I said, why don't you go talk to her a little bit more? So then he goes and talks to her. Then he calls me at the house and he says, she's cut it to $150,000. I said, wow, great deal. 8 acres in Jacksonville? I said, but we're still paying off this other. I said, have her sharpen her pencil. So a couple days later, he and Katie Cocker went over and talked to her. And they came back and said, she's giving it to you. So we ended up with that completely. Now we move on. This is the last story here, Saving the Grove. What a story that is. That took 4 years of piecing that together. Now, the Grove is right there below the Beekman Woods. It's about 6.5 acres right there. Has a fritillaria on it, which got us the grant. But when you're doing a grant, everything has to line up. The purchase grant has to be there. The matching grant, which came from another piece of property. The purchase option had to be there, and the land appraisal. The land appraisal is only good for a year. So if anything goes more longer than a year, you lose the land appraisal. If you get that back in, maybe you've lost the purchase option. The family, the Woods family, gave, I think, 8 purchase options on that property to hold it. And, but they all had sunsets. And I'll never forget what she said from the Trust for Public Land. If this project is successful, I believe in reincarnation. Because it's been dead so many times. Well, it turned out that there was a state legislature that had her foot on the auction hose. And she said that it had to flow through the state legislature. And she said that private land should not go for public use because it reduces taxes to the taxing people. So here comes Mr. Burl in. So we talked to Mike Burl Sr., managed to get to the state legislature and had a little conversation and so forth. And during that time, I met with Senator Shields' Environmental Land Use Committee, and we had help from Senator Bates and Representative Esquivel and Atkinson. They all got involved in this. By the time I got done, I had 3/4 of a ream of letters and emails on this whole thing. And it kept piling up, piling up, piling up. And then finally, from Senator Atkinson, I got this. It was about 2 hours before the legislature was done for the season. And it says, Larry, wanted to let you know that the line item for the Jacksonville Woodlands is secure at $358,000. Congratulations. And we just made everything just by 2 hours, which was amazing. So that's the Grove. And what a magnificent piece of property. And that's where we're going to be heading next during a hike-a-thon. So thank you very, very much.
Story.